They called me the family failure at 29, still riding the bus, while they flaunted their luxury cars and designer lives. At Colton's dinner table, surrounded by relatives who measured worth in dollar signs, I endured their pitying smiles and condescending questions about my little job. When my brother smirked and asked if I was still taking public transport, their laughter felt like daggers. But as they mocked my modest life, I quietly reached into my purse and pulled out a single document that would shatter their smugness forever. The deed to the luxury car dealership where half of them had bought their precious BMWs and Mercedes. They thought my silence meant defeat. They had no idea it meant I was calculating. And when you underestimate a woman who's been building an empire in the shadows, the reckoning doesn't come with a roar. It comes with receipts. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. My name is Laurel Greystone, and I should probably start by telling you that I've never been the kind of person who fits into rooms easily. At 29, I've learned to accept that about myself. Some people walk into a space and command attention without trying. Others, like me, prefer the corners where we can watch, listen, and think. That Tuesday evening in October, as I stood outside my brother Colton's sprawling estate in Millbrook Heights, I reminded myself of exactly that. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, handwritten on expensive cardstock that probably cost more than my monthly bus pass. Family dinner, it said. Time we all reconnected. I hadn't heard from Colton in almost 2 years. Not since he'd struck it rich with some cryptocurrency venture that I'd barely understood. Before that windfall, we'd exchanged maybe a dozen words since our father's funeral 5 years ago. So when his invitation arrived at my modest one-bedroom apartment downtown, I knew it wasn't born from brotherly love or sudden nostalgia. The house before me was a testament to new money trying very hard to look like old money. Georgian columns, manicured hedges, and a circular driveway filled with vehicles that cost more than most people's homes. I smoothed down my navy dress, the nicest thing I owned, and walked toward the front door. My canvas flats made soft sounds against the stone pathway, a stark contrast to the click of expensive heels I could hear from the other guests already inside. I was 45 minutes late, partly because the evening bus had been delayed, and partly because I'd sat on a bench at the corner for 20 minutes, gathering courage. Through the tall windows, I could see figures moving about in what looked like a living room larger than my entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over people who seemed to glow with the kind of confidence that comes from never worrying about rent. The door opened before I could knock. Colton stood there, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the boy I'd grown up with before his practiced smile slid into place. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, his dark hair styled perfectly, his wedding ring catching the light. "Laurel," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. "You made it." Traffic was terrible, I lied, because saying I'd taken 2 buses and walked 6 blocks seemed like starting the evening on the wrong foot. He stepped aside to let me in, and I was immediately struck by the marble foyer with its sweeping staircase and abstract art that looked like it belonged in a museum. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted from deeper in the house, along with the scent of something expensive being served for dinner. "Everyone's in the living room," Colton said, his hand on my elbow guiding me forward. "They're excited to see you." I doubted that, but I followed him anyway. The living room was exactly what I'd glimpsed from outside, only more overwhelming up close. Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors, and the furniture looked like it had been featured in architectural magazines. About a dozen people were scattered around the space, drinks in hand, engaged in animated conversations that paused when I entered. "Look who finally decided to join us," Colton announced, and every head turned toward me. I recognized most of them, though they'd all changed in the years since I'd seen them last. There was Aunt Marjorie, my father's sister, wearing what looked like a designer pantsuit and enough jewelry to fund a small business. Her husband Preston stood beside her, still carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd made his fortune in real estate and never let anyone forget it. Their son Tanner, 2 years younger than me, had clearly inherited his father's confidence along with his mother's sharp features. He wore his Ivy League education like a badge, and I could see him sizing me up from across the room. Then there were the cousins from my mother's side, faces I barely remembered, but who seemed to remember me perfectly. They clustered together near the fireplace, designer handbags at their feet, wine glasses in their manicured hands. "Laurel, darling." Aunt Marjorie approached me with their kisses that didn't quite touch my cheeks. "You look, well." The pause before "well" spoke volumes. "Thank you," I replied. "Your home is beautiful, Colton." "Oh, this old place," he said with false modesty. "We're actually thinking of upgrading soon. The market's been incredible." Preston nodded approvingly. "Smart move." I told him last month, never settle when you're riding a wave like this. I accepted a glass of water from a server who appeared at my elbow and found a spot near the window where I could observe without being the center of attention. The conversations resumed around me, topics flowing from vacation homes in the Hamptons to private schools for children I didn't know existed to investment opportunities that made my head spin. "So, Laurel." Tanner approached me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Colton tells us you're still in the city. What kind of work are you doing these days?" The way he said work made it sound quaint, like a hobby I'd picked up. "I'm in automotive sales," I said simply. "Oh, how interesting," Marjorie chimed in from nearby. She'd clearly been listening. "Like at one of those big dealerships? I imagine the commission can be quite good." "Something like that," I replied, taking a sip of my water. "Do you enjoy it?" This from a cousin whose name I couldn't remember, but who was wearing a watch that probably cost more than my yearly salary.
"Ida."
There's something satisfying about helping people find exactly what they need. Tanner laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either.
"I bet."
Though I have to ask, and forgive me if this is too personal, but are you still renting that little place downtown? The room had grown quieter, though people were pretending not to listen. I felt the familiar weight of being the family disappointment, the one who hadn't lived up to whatever potential they thought I'd had. "I am," I said. "It suits my needs." "Of course it does," Marjorie said warmly, but there was pity in her eyes. "Not everyone needs to own property. Renting can be so much simpler." Preston nodded sagely. "Less responsibility. Some people are just more comfortable that way." The conversation moved on, but I caught the glances, the small smiles, the way they seemed to file away this information about poor Laurel, who still rented and worked in sales. Dinner was announced, and we moved to a dining room that belonged in a palace, with a table that could seat 20 and enough silverware to confuse a diplomat. I found myself seated between a cousin who worked in marketing and Tanner, who seemed determined to draw me into conversations that highlighted how different our lives had become. He talked about his law firm, his recent promotion, his plans to buy a weekend house in Vermont. I listened and responded when necessary, but mostly I watched. It was during dessert that Colton delivered the blow I'd been expecting all evening. "You know, Laurel," he said, his voice carrying across the table. "I was just thinking on the drive over tonight about how far we've all come. Remember when we were kids, and you used to say you'd never need a car because buses were more environmentally friendly?" A few people chuckled. I remembered no such conversation, but I smiled anyway. "Still riding the bus everywhere?" he continued, and now the whole table was paying attention. "It's so admirable how you stick to your principles." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laughter of people who found my life choices quaint and slightly pitiable. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my expression neutral. "Public transportation has its advantages," I said calmly. "Oh, absolutely," Marjorie agreed. "So much more affordable than car payments and insurance and all those expenses." "And parking in the city," Preston added. "Nightmare." Though I have to say, Tanner leaned forward, there's something to be said for having your own wheels. Freedom, you know? Independence. I nodded as if considering this profound observation, while inside, something cold and determined settled in my chest. They had no idea. For the past 2 years, while they'd been posting Instagram photos of their luxury purchases and humble bragging about their success, I'd been building something. Something real, something lasting, something that would outlast their crypto windfalls and trust fund safety nets. I let them laugh. I let them pity me. I sipped my water and smiled at their jokes about my little job and my modest lifestyle. Because in my purse, folded neatly in an envelope, was a document that would change everything. The deed to Luxride Motors, the fastest-growing luxury car dealership in the tri-state area. The same dealership where Colton had bought his BMW 3 months ago, strutting around the showroom like he owned the place, never knowing that the quiet woman who'd handled his paperwork was his sister. The same sister he was mocking now. As dessert plates were cleared and the conversation turned to plans for the holidays, I reached into my purse. My fingers touched the envelope, and I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. "You know," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter. "Speaking of cars, I have something interesting to share." I pulled out the deed and placed it gently on the table in front of me. The conversation died. "Funny thing," I continued, looking directly at Colton. "I just bought the place where you got your BMW." The silence that followed my revelation stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I watched their faces process what I'd said, confusion giving way to skepticism, giving way to something that might have been respect, if any of them were capable of feeling that for me. But to understand how we got to that moment, I need to take you back 2 years, to a Tuesday morning in March when my life fell apart and then slowly, quietly began to rebuild itself into something stronger. I'd been working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and let me use the skills I developed in college before student loans and real life had forced me to take whatever job I could find. I was good at it too. I understood how to reach people, how to present information in ways that made them want to act. So when my boss called me into her office that Tuesday and told me they were restructuring and my position was being eliminated, I wasn't prepared. 23 employees were let go that day. All of us herded into conference rooms like cattle, handed our severance packages, and escorted out by security. I sat in my apartment that night, looking at my bank account, and doing math that didn't add up no matter how many times I recalculated. 2 months of severance pay, maybe 3 if I was careful. Rent was due in 2 weeks. The job market was terrible, and I knew that finding something comparable could take months. That's when I saw the ad on Craigslist. Receptionist needed, small auto dealership, immediate start, cash daily. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was what I needed. Henderson's used cars sat on a corner lot that had seen better days, squeezed between a laundromat and a tax preparation office. The building was maybe 20 years old but looked 40, with faded signs and a parking lot that needed repaving. Inside wasn't much better. Fluorescent lights that flickered, mismatched furniture, and a filing system that seemed to involve stacking papers wherever there was space. Eli Henderson was the owner, a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and hands that showed decades of honest work. He interviewed me in his cluttered office, apologizing for the mess and the broken air conditioner and the coffee that tasted like motor oil. "I'll be straight with you," he said, leaning back in a chair that squeaked ominously. "This isn't a career move. I need someone to answer phones, handle paperwork, maybe help customers when they come in. It's not glamorous and the pay isn't great, but I'm honest and I pay on time." I liked him immediately. What I discovered over the next few weeks was that Eli Henderson was running his business the same way he had for 30 years, which might have been fine in 1990, but was killing him in the digital age. He advertised in the local newspaper and the Yellow Pages. He kept customer information on index cards. His idea of online presence was a website that looked like it had been designed during the Clinton administration. But the man knew cars. He could diagnose problems by sound, spot a lemon from across a lot, and had a reputation for honesty that kept long-time customers coming back. The problem was, long-time customers were literally dying off and new ones couldn't find him. I started small. During slow afternoons, I reorganized his filing system. I created a simple spreadsheet to track inventory and sales. I convinced him to let me take better photos of the cars and post them on Craigslist with detailed descriptions instead of "good car, runs great, $3,000 OBO." "You don't have to do all this," Eli said one day, finding me staying late to update his records. "I'm paying you to answer phones." "I know," I said, "but I like solving problems. And you have a lot of problems." He laughed at that, but he let me keep working. Within 6 weeks, we were getting calls from customers who'd found us online. I set up a simple Facebook page and started posting photos of our inventory. I researched comparable vehicles and helped Eli price his cars more competitively. I created a customer database and started following up with previous buyers, which led to referrals and repeat business. The transformation wasn't dramatic at first. An extra sale here, a faster turnover there. But by month 3, Eli was moving inventory twice as fast as he had been. By month 6, he'd cleared out cars that had been sitting on the lot for over a year. "I don't understand what you're doing," he said one afternoon, looking at the sales reports I'd started generating. "But whatever it is, keep doing it." What I was doing was applying everything I'd learned in my previous job to a business that desperately needed it. I was treating customers like human beings instead of walking wallets. I was using data to make decisions instead of relying on gut feelings. I was bringing a 30-year-old business into the 21st century. And I was learning. Every evening after work, I went home and researched. I read about automotive sales, digital marketing, customer relationship management. I took online courses in business finance and inventory management. I studied successful dealerships and figured out what they were doing that we weren't. The breakthrough came during month 8. Eli had been struggling with a particularly expensive car, a luxury sedan that had been on the lot for months. It was a good car, but the price point was higher than most of his customers were looking for. "Maybe I should just take a loss on it," he said one morning, staring at the vehicle like it had personally offended him. "Or maybe we're marketing to the wrong people," I suggested. I spent that weekend creating a targeted social media campaign, focusing on professionals in nearby suburbs who might be looking for a reliable luxury vehicle at a fraction of the new car price. I wrote detailed posts about the car's features, its maintenance history, its value proposition. I boosted the posts to reach people within a 30-mile radius who had expressed interest in similar vehicles. The car sold within a week to a doctor from Westchester who drove down specifically to see it. "You double my profit on that sale," Eli said, shaking his head in amazement. "Just by putting it in front of the right people." "That's what marketing is," I replied. "Finding the people who need what you have and showing them why they need it." That's when he made me an offer that changed everything. "I've been thinking," he said one Friday evening as we locked up. "You're doing more than receptionist work. Hell, you're doing more than sales work. You're running half this business, and you're doing it better than I ever did." I waited, not sure where this was going. "I'm 67 years old, Laurel. My wife keeps asking when I'm going to retire, and honestly, I've been asking myself the same question. But I couldn't figure out how to leave this place without watching it die." He pulled out a folder I'd never seen before. "I want to offer you a partnership. 25% to start, with the option to buy more shares over time. You'd be handling all the marketing, customer relations, and business development. I'd focus on what I do best, evaluating cars, managing the lot, working with suppliers." I stared at the paperwork, my heart racing. 25% of a business that was finally turning a real profit. A chance to build something instead of just working for someone else. "I can't pay you what it's worth up front," Eli continued. "But we can structure it so you earn your shares through sweat equity and a percentage of the increased profits. What do you say?" What I said was yes. The next year was a blur of 18-hour days, learning curves that felt more like learning cliffs, and small victories that added up to something significant. I expanded our online presence, developed relationships with automotive auction houses, and created a customer service experience that had people referring their friends and family. We rebranded slightly, updating our signs and our image, while keeping Eli's reputation for honesty at the center of everything we did. I negotiated better deals with suppliers, implemented a more sophisticated inventory management system, and started tracking metrics that helped us make smarter decisions about what to buy and how to price it. But I also learned something else during that year. I was good at this. Not just the marketing and the customer service, but the business itself. I understood the rhythm of buying and selling, the psychology of customers, the economics of the automotive industry. I had found something I was not just competent at, but genuinely talented at. Meanwhile, my family continued their lives completely unaware of what I was building. Colton posted photos of his crypto portfolio and his expensive purchases. Tanner shared updates about his law firm and his networking events. They were making noise about their success, while I was quietly building something real. I lived in the same modest apartment, took the same buses, wore the same simple clothes. Every dollar I made went back into learning, improving, and eventually investing in the business. I could have bought a car months earlier, but I chose not to. Partly because I was reinvesting everything, but partly because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be underestimated. When Eli decided to retire 18 months later, he offered to sell me the remaining 75% of the business. By then, we tripled our revenue and built a customer base of over 2,000 people. I had saved every penny I could, secured a business loan, and had a detailed plan for expansion. The day I became the sole owner of what would soon become Luxride Motors was the same day I decided to completely rebrand and reposition the business. Instead of competing in the used car market, we would focus on certified pre-owned luxury vehicles. Instead of being a neighborhood lot, we would serve the entire tri-state area. I spent months researching luxury car buyers, understanding their concerns, their preferences, their shopping behaviors. I developed a white-glove service experience that treated every customer like they were buying a new Rolls-Royce instead of a 3-year-old BMW. I created partnerships with luxury car manufacturers, obtained certifications that let us offer extended warranties, and built a reputation for selling only the highest quality vehicles. The transformation took 8 months, during which I worked 7 days a week and learned more about business than I had in my entire previous career. When we reopened as Luxride Motors, we had a completely redesigned showroom, a sophisticated online presence, and an inventory of carefully selected luxury vehicles that would appeal to discerning customers. The first month, we sold 12 cars. The second month, 18. By month 6, we were moving 30 to 40 vehicles per month and had a waiting list of customers looking for specific models. 3 months ago, a confident young man walked into my showroom and fell in love with a midnight blue BMW that I'd just acquired from a lease return. He paid cash, treated my sales associate like hired help, and bragged about his latest crypto windfall while the paperwork was being processed. I watched him from my office, remembering the boy who used to build forts with me in our backyard, before life and family expectations and different definitions of success had driven us apart. He never looked toward the office. He never asked who owned the dealership. He just signed his papers and drove away in his new car, never knowing that the quiet sister he pitied had sold it to him. The silence at Colton's dinner table stretched until it became uncomfortable, then awkward, then almost unbearable. I watched their faces as they processed what I'd just revealed, some of them picking up the deed to examine it more closely, others simply staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings. Aunt Marjorie was the first to recover, and her response was exactly what I'd expected. "Well," she said, her voice carefully measured, "that's quite a coincidence. Though I suppose there must be some explanation." She paused delicately. "Perhaps it was inherited? Or maybe you're part of an investment group." The implication was clear. There was no way quiet, bus-riding Laurel could have actually earned something like this on her own. I felt the familiar sting of their assumption, but this time it was tempered by something else, a calm confidence that came from knowing exactly what I was worth. "Actually," I said, setting down my water glass, "I built the business from the ground up over the past 2 years. Started as a receptionist at a failing used car lot and turned it into the fastest-growing luxury dealership in the region." Tanner leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "That's quite a story, Laurel. I have to say, it seems almost too good to be true. The luxury car market is incredibly competitive, especially for independent dealers." "It is competitive," I agreed. "Which is why most dealers focus on volume and price. We focus on experience and service. Our customers pay more because they get more." "And you did this all yourself?" Preston asked, his real estate developer's mind clearly skeptical. "No investors? No family money?" I almost laughed at the irony of that question, coming from him. Every dollar came from revenue and a business loan I qualified for based on our performance metrics. "I can show you the financials if you're interested." The offer hung in the air, and I watched Preston weigh his curiosity against his ego. He wasn't used to being challenged by people he considered beneath him, and certainly not by family members he'd written off as failures. "That won't be necessary," he said finally, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Colton had been unusually quiet since my revelation, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the woman sitting across from him. Finally, he spoke. "I remember that place," he said slowly. "Henderson's, right? It was a dump when I drove by it a couple years ago." "It was," I confirmed. Eli Henderson had been running it the same way for 30 years. Good man, great reputation, but no idea how to reach customers in the digital age. "And you transformed it?" "We transformed it together." Eli knew cars better than anyone I've ever met. I knew marketing and customer service. It turned out to be a good combination. I could see some of my cousins exchanging glances, probably wondering if this changed their perception of me, or if they should continue treating me like the family disappointment. Marjorie, however, wasn't ready to let go of her narrative. "Well, it's certainly ambitious," she said, the word ambitious carrying just enough condescension to sting. "I do hope you have good legal and financial advice. Small businesses can be so volatile."
He replied.
Though I appreciate the concern. The conversation moved on after that, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. People were looking at me differently, some with curiosity, others with what might have been respect, and a few with something that looked uncomfortably like calculation. After dinner, as people mingled in the living room with coffee and after-dinner drinks, I found myself in several smaller conversations that revealed more about my family than the previous 2 years of silence had. Ivy, one of my younger cousins, approached me near the fireplace. She was probably 26, married to a man I'd met briefly earlier who worked in finance, and she'd always seemed like one of the more grounded members of our extended family. "Laurel," she said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, curious about where this was going. "When you were building your business, were you ever scared? Like, terrified that you were making a huge mistake?" There was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully. Behind the designer dress and the perfect makeup, I could see strain around her eyes, tension in the way she held her shoulders. "Every single day," I said honestly, "especially in the beginning. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning wondering if I was delusional to think I could make it work. But you kept going anyway." "I kept going anyway. Sometimes because I believed in what I was building, and sometimes just because I didn't know what else to do." She nodded, and I could see her processing this. "It's just, everyone makes it look so easy, you know? Like success is just something that happens to some people and not others." "Success is mostly just not quitting when things get hard," I said. "And things get hard a lot." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for being honest about that." Later, I found myself in conversation with Tanner, who had cornered me near the kitchen. His approach was more direct than his mother's passive aggression, but just as revealing. "I have to admit, I'm curious about your business model," he said, though his tone suggested skepticism more than genuine interest. "The luxury car market has pretty established players. How does a small independent dealer compete with the big franchises?" "By not trying to be them," I replied. "The big dealers have advantages we can't match: brand recognition, advertising budgets, volume discounts. But they also have disadvantages we don't have. Such as, they're big, which means they can't provide personalized service. They can't be flexible on terms or creative with solutions. They have to follow corporate policies that might not serve individual customers well." Tanner nodded as if this made sense, but I could see him filing away information for some purpose I couldn't identify. "And you've found enough customers who value that personalized approach to build a sustainable business?" "More than enough. Our biggest challenge now is finding inventory fast enough to meet demand." "Interesting," he said, though something in his expression suggested he found it more concerning than interesting. It was Preston who made the offer I'd been half expecting all evening. "Laurel," he said, approaching me as I was getting ready to leave, "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. You've clearly got good instincts for business, and I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished." I waited, knowing there was more coming. I'm always looking for smart people to work with, especially family. If you're ever interested in expanding, or maybe diversifying into real estate investment, I'd be happy to discuss some opportunities. The offer was smoothly presented, but I could see through it easily enough. Preston was used to being the successful one in the family, the one other people came to for advice and opportunities. My unexpected success had disrupted that dynamic, and he was trying to reassert his position by offering to help me. "That's generous of you," I said carefully, "but I'm pretty focused on growing what I've already built. Maybe in a few years when things are more established." His smile tightened slightly, the response clearly not what he'd hoped for. "Of course. Though I should mention, timing can be everything in business. Opportunities don't always wait for us to be ready." It sounded like friendly advice until I heard the undertone, the subtle suggestion that turning down his offer might be a mistake I'd regret. The evening finally wound down, and I found myself standing in Colton's foyer again, this time with several family members offering lukewarm congratulations and vague promises to stay in touch. The dynamic had definitely shifted, but I wasn't naive enough to think it had shifted entirely in my favor. As I waited for my rideshare to arrive, Colton walked me to the door. "I have to say, Laurel, tonight was unexpected." "I imagine it was. I'm curious about something, though. Why didn't you ever mention what you were building? I mean, we're family. If you needed help or advice." I turned to look at him directly. "When was the last time you asked me how I was doing, Colton?" Really asked, not just made conversation at a funeral or sent a Christmas card. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Point taken. "I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd be interested. And because I wanted to build something that was entirely mine, without anyone being able to say I'd had help or connections or advantages." He nodded slowly. "I can understand that." My phone buzzed with a notification that my ride had arrived. "I should go," I said. "Laurel," he called as I reached for the door handle. "I know we haven't been close. I know I haven't been the brother I should have been. But I want you to know I'm proud of what you've accomplished." I studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but finding what seemed like genuine regret. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you might realize." But as I sat in the back of the car heading home, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had been the beginning of something rather than the end. I'd revealed my success to a family that wasn't used to being surprised, and I'd seen the calculations behind their eyes as they processed this new information. Preston's offer had been predictable, but it had also been a warning. People like him didn't appreciate being upstaged, especially by people they'd dismissed. Tanner's questions had been too pointed, too focused on specifics that a casual conversation wouldn't require. And Marjorie's passive-aggressive skepticism suggested she wasn't ready to accept that quiet Laurel had actually accomplished something significant. I'd won this round, but the game was far from over. The next morning, I arrived at Luxride Motors to find Caro, my young assistant, looking unusually nervous. "There's something I need to tell you," she said before I'd even made it to my office. I poured myself coffee and settled behind my desk, noting the way she was fidgeting with her phone. "What's on your mind?" "I got a call yesterday," she said, "from someone asking questions about the business. About you specifically." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of questions?" "Financial stuff. How long you'd owned the dealership, whether you had partners, what kind of revenue we generated." They said they were from a trade publication doing a story about successful women in automotive, but they knew too much already. Like they'd done research before they called. And they asked really specific questions about our inventory management system and our customer database. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. "Did you tell them anything?" "Just the basic stuff that's already public, when we rebranded, how long we've been in business. But I got uncomfortable and said they'd have to talk to you directly for anything else." "Good. Did they leave contact information?" "They said they'd call back." I spent the rest of the morning thinking about that phone call and about the looks I'd seen around Colton's dinner table the night before. Someone was asking questions about my business, and the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. That afternoon, I got my answer when Eli stopped by the dealership. "Laurel," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with a serious expression, "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." I waited. I got a call this morning from my son, Danny. You remember Danny? He moved to Phoenix a few years back, works in commercial real estate now. I nodded, remembering the tall, quiet man who'd helped with some of the dealership's paperwork during the ownership transition. Someone approached him yesterday, offered to buy the small percentage of the business he still owns, the 5% I gave him as part of my retirement planning. My blood went cold. Someone local? That's the thing. Danny said the man was very well dressed, very professional, claimed to represent a group of investors interested in acquiring successful independent dealerships. But he knew details about our business that aren't public information. What kind of details? Our exact revenue figures from last year, the terms of your loan, the specifics of our inventory rotation system. Eli's expression was grim. The kind of information someone would need if they were planning to make a competitive offer for the whole business. I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in my mind. The questions Tanner had asked about my business model. Preston's pointed comments about timing and opportunities. The mysterious phone call to Caro. Did Danny sell?
Hell no.
He called me first, and I told him to tell them the shares weren't for sale at any price. But Laurel, this feels like the beginning of something, not the end. I agreed. Someone was making moves against my business, and I had a pretty good idea who it might be. What I didn't know yet was how far they were willing to go, or what they thought they could accomplish. But I'd learned something important over the past 2 years. Being underestimated was sometimes an advantage. Let them think I was still the quiet, naive woman they'd always known. Let them make their plans and their offers and their subtle threats. I'd built something real from nothing once before. If I had to do it again, I would. But first, I was going to find out exactly what game they thought they were playing, and then I was going to change the rules. After Eli's warning about someone trying to buy Danny's shares, I knew I couldn't wait for the next move. I spent the weekend digging into public records, business filings, and social media activity, looking for connections between my family members and any investment groups or business entities that might be targeting my dealership. What I found was more subtle than I'd expected, but just as concerning. Preston's real estate company had recently formed a subsidiary called Tri-State Automotive Holdings. The filing was only 3 weeks old, just after our family dinner. Tanner's law firm was listed as the registered agent. And while I couldn't prove it definitively, the timing suggested they'd moved quickly after learning about my success. I also discovered that Preston had a history of acquiring struggling businesses, improving them with minimal investment, and then flipping them for significant profits. It was a perfectly legal strategy, but it required identifying targets that could be purchased below market value, often from owners who didn't fully understand their business's worth or who could be pressured into selling. The problem with their plan was that I wasn't struggling, and I wasn't naive about my business's value. Monday morning brought clarity in the form of a phone call from a man who introduced himself as Marcus Webb from Elite Automotive Investments. His voice was smooth, professional, and completely unfamiliar. Ms. Greystone, I hope you don't mind the cold call, but I've been hearing impressive things about Luxride Motors, and I'd love to discuss some potential opportunities with you. What kind of opportunities? I asked, settling back in my chair and reaching for a notepad. Well, we specialize in helping successful independent dealers expand their operations. Capital injection, operational expertise, access to exclusive inventory sources, that sort of thing. Would you be interested in meeting for coffee this week? It was exactly the kind of approach Eli had warned me about. Too smooth, too convenient, too perfectly timed. I appreciate the interest, I said, but I'm not looking for investors at the moment. Of course. But you know how quickly things can change in this business. Having the right partners can make the difference between surviving and thriving when challenges arise. The subtle threat wasn't lost on me. What kind of challenges are you referring to? Oh, supply chain disruptions, increased competition, regulatory changes. The automotive industry can be unpredictable. It's always good to have experienced people in your corner. I agreed to meet him Thursday afternoon, not because I was interested in his offer, but because I wanted to see what they thought they were dealing with. The meeting was at an upscale coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where business deals were discussed over $15 lattes. Marcus Webb turned out to be a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with a kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He spent the first 10 minutes flattering my business acumen and asking questions about my expansion plans. Then he made his pitch. "We're prepared to offer you $3 million for 60% of Luxride Motors," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "That would give you immediate liquidity while allowing you to continue running day-to-day operations." It was a lowball offer disguised as generosity. My business was worth easily twice that, and 60% control would mean they could outvote me on any major decisions. "That's generous," I said, not opening the folder, "but I'm not interested in selling any portion of my business." His smile never wavered. "I understand the emotional attachment to something you've built from scratch. But sometimes the smart move is to take some chips off the table while you're ahead." "I'm curious," I said, leaning forward slightly. "How did you hear about my business?" "We don't exactly advertise our financials. Word gets around in the industry. Successful independent dealers are rare enough that people notice." It was a non-answer, but I let it slide. "Well, I appreciate the interest, but like I said, I'm not looking to sell." "Fair enough. Though I should mention, we're not the only group that's been asking about independent dealers in this market. Competition for quality assets can get intense." Another subtle threat. I smiled and thanked him for his time, then watched him leave, noting that he drove a luxury sedan I'd sold 6 months earlier to a customer who'd paid cash and given Preston's real estate office as his business address. That evening, I called Caro into my office. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She nodded, looking nervous. "Have you had any other contact with that reporter who called last week? Or anyone else asking questions about the business?" "Not exactly," she said slowly. "But there was something weird that happened yesterday." I waited. I got a text from someone claiming to be a recruiter for a luxury car dealership in Connecticut. They wanted to set up an interview for a management position that would pay almost double what I make here. My heart sank. "Did you respond?" "I told them I wasn't interested, but they kept pushing. Said the offer was time-sensitive and I should at least hear them out." "Caro," I said gently, "I need you to know that if you ever want to leave for a better opportunity, I'll support that decision. But I also need you to understand that timing like this usually isn't coincidental." She looked confused, so I explained what I'd discovered about the attempted buyout, the mysterious investors, and the connection to my family. "Oh my God," she said when I finished. "They're trying to steal your employees? They're trying to destabilize the business to force me to sell. Poaching key staff is a classic move. What do you want me to do? For now, just keep doing your job and let me know if anyone else contacts you. And Caro, thank you for being honest about this." The next morning brought the most direct approach yet. Tanner called my personal cell phone. "Laurel, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly, but I wanted to discuss something with you in a professional capacity." "What's on your mind?" "I've been hearing some concerning rumors about potential regulatory changes that could affect independent dealers. Environmental compliance, safety standards, that sort of thing. I thought you might want some legal advice on how to protect yourself." It was beautifully done, offering help while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about my business's stability. "I appreciate the concern, but I have a good relationship with my current attorney." "Of course. Though you know how these things work. Sometimes it's not about having good legal counsel, but about having the right connections when regulations are being written." "And you have those connections?" "My firm has represented several automotive industry clients through regulatory transitions. We understand the landscape." I could see where this was heading. First, create problems or the perception of problems. Then offer solutions that required giving up control or accepting unfavorable terms. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. "Thanks for thinking of me." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 30s with auburn hair and tired eyes knocked on my office door and introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," she said, "but I heard you might be able to help me with a car situation." I invited her to sit and asked what she needed. "My car died last week, and I'm a single mom with 2 kids. I need something reliable, but I don't have much money, and most dealers won't even talk to me because my credit isn't great." It was exactly the kind of situation that reminded me why I'd gotten into this business in the first place. What's your budget? I have about $2,000 saved, and I could maybe do small payments if someone would work with me. I spent an hour with Jennifer, reviewing her situation and showing her a few vehicles that might work. We found a reliable sedan that needed minor cosmetic work, but was mechanically sound. I arranged financing through a credit union that specialized in helping people rebuild their credit, and by the time she left, she had keys to a car that would serve her family well. It was exactly the kind of transaction that larger dealerships couldn't or wouldn't handle, and it reminded me why I'd chosen to build my business the way I had. That evening, as I was locking up, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Eli's number, but when I answered, it was a voice I didn't recognize. Ms. Greystone? This is Detective Rodriguez with the city police. Mr. Henderson asked me to call you. There's been an incident at his house. My blood went cold. What kind of incident? Break-in, but nothing was taken. Mr. Henderson is fine, but he's pretty shaken up. The strange thing is, they only seemed interested in his home office. Papers were scattered around, but electronics and valuables weren't touched. I knew immediately what they'd been looking for. Any remaining documents related to the dealership sale, financial records, or other information that could be used against me. I'll be right there, I said. I found Eli at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a grim expression. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. They were looking for something specific, he said without preamble. Went straight to my filing cabinets, pulled out anything related to the business sale. Left everything else alone. Did they find anything useful? Nothing they didn't already have. Most of the important stuff was transferred to your files months ago. He looked up at me with concern. Laurel, this is escalating. Maybe you should consider taking that offer and getting out while you can. Absolutely not, I said, sitting across from him. Running away isn't going to solve this, and it's exactly what they want me to do. So, what's your plan? I'd been thinking about that all week. I'm going to give them what they think they want, and then I'm going to show them why that was a mistake. The charity gala was perfect, the kind of high society event where my family would be in their element, confident and off guard. I bought a ticket under my business name and arrived fashionably late, wearing a black dress that had cost more than my old monthly salary, but less than what I'd made that afternoon selling a vintage Porsche to a collector for Manhattan. I spotted Colton first, holding court near the bar with Preston and Tanner. They were clearly in good spirits, probably celebrating whatever progress they thought they were making with their buyout scheme. I watched them for a few minutes before making my approach. "Gentlemen," I said, appearing at Colton's elbow with a smile. "Fancy meeting you here." The surprise on their faces was worth the price of admission. "Laurel." Colton recovered first, though I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "I didn't know you were interested in the Children's Hospital Foundation." "I've been supporting them for months," I replied truthfully. "Amazing what they can do with the right resources." Preston stepped forward with his practiced charm. "How wonderful to see you again, dear. I was just telling Colton and Tanner about some exciting developments in the automotive investment space." "Really? What kind of developments?" Tanner joined the conversation with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards. "There's been a lot of consolidation in the independent dealer market. Smaller operations are finding it harder to compete with the big franchise networks." "Interesting," I said. I hadn't noticed that trend affecting my business. "Well," Preston said smoothly, "sometimes these things take time to become apparent. Market forces can be gradual until they're not." I sipped my wine and nodded, as if considering this profound observation. "You know, it's funny you mention market forces. I've been experiencing some unusual activity lately." "Oh." Tanner's attempt at casual interest was almost believable. Mysterious investors making unsolicited offers, competitors trying to poach my staff, even some suspicious activity around my mentor's home. It's almost like someone is trying to create problems for my business. The silence that followed was brief, but telling. "That does sound concerning," Preston said carefully. "Though I suppose success always attracts attention, both wanted and unwanted." "True," I agreed. "The question is whether that attention represents opportunity or a threat." I've always found it depends on how you respond to it, Tanner added, his lawyer instincts clearly engaged. I smiled and excused myself to use the restroom, but instead I found a quiet corner and made a phone call. Marcus? It's Laurel Greystone. I've been thinking about your offer, and I'd like to discuss it further. Can you meet tomorrow afternoon? When I returned to the party, I made sure to spend time talking with other guests, particularly those in the automotive and business communities. By the time I left, I'd planted seeds of information that would reach the right ears by morning. The next afternoon, I sat across from Marcus Webb again, this time with a folder of my own. I have to admit, you were right about market pressures, I began. Things have gotten more complicated than I expected. His eyes lit up with the confidence of a predator sensing wounded prey. I'm glad you reached out, he said. Though I should mention, given some recent developments in the market, our terms have adjusted slightly. He slid a new folder across the table. This time the offer was $2.5 million for 70%. I understand, I said, opening the folder and pretending to review the terms. Though I do have some questions about the structure. We spent an hour discussing details, with me asking increasingly specific questions about their financing, their other holdings, and their long-term plans. Marcus answered readily, clearly confident that I was close to accepting. There is one thing, I said as we prepared to wrap up. I need to see proof of funds and a detailed business plan for the integration. Due diligence works both ways. Of course, he agreed. Though I should mention, this offer expires Friday. We have other opportunities we're evaluating. I understand. I'll have an answer for you by then. That evening, I received the documents I'd requested, and they confirmed everything I'd suspected. Elite Automotive Investments was a shell company funded primarily by Prestons Real Estate Ventures, with Tanner's law firm handling the legal structure. Their business plan involved acquiring my dealership, merging it with two other independent dealers they'd recently purchased, and then selling the combined operation to a national chain within 18 months. It was a purely financial play with no regard for customers, employees, or the communities these businesses served. Friday morning, I called Marcus to arrange our final meeting. I've made my decision, I told him, but I'd prefer to discuss it in person. We met at the same coffee shop, but this time I arrived with my own attorney and a briefcase full of documents. Before we discuss your offer, I said, placing a thick folder on the table, I thought you might be interested in seeing what due diligence looks like when it's done properly. Marcus's confident expression faltered as I began laying out documents. Elite Automotive Investments, incorporated 3 weeks ago with Prestons Greystone as the primary investor. Tanner Greystone's law firm as registered agent. Previous acquisitions of Henderson Auto Sales. Oh wait, that didn't work out, did it? And Westfield Motors, which you acquired last month from an owner who was being investigated for tax evasion. I continued placing documents on the table. Phone records showing calls between your office and members of my family immediately following a dinner where my business was discussed. Surveillance photos of your associate breaking into Eli Henderson's home. And my personal favorite, recordings of conversations where threats were made regarding regulatory changes and market pressures. Marcus had gone very pale. I don't know what you think you're proving, but dash. I'm proving that your offer isn't a business proposition, it's extortion. And that you've underestimated both me and the documentation I keep on people who threaten my livelihood. My attorney leaned forward. Ms. Greystone has asked me to inform you that she's declining your offer. She's also asked me to mention that copies of this evidence have been provided to the State Attorney General's office, the Better Business Bureau, and the Automotive Dealers Association. You can't prove anything illegal, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. I don't need to prove anything illegal, I replied. I just need to prove you're not the kind of people anyone should do business with. I stood to leave, then paused. Oh, and Marcus? That sedan you're driving? The one you bought from my dealership 6 months ago? I'm canceling your extended warranty. Effective immediately. That afternoon, I received 3 phone calls. The first was from Tanner demanding to know what I thought I was doing. The second was from Preston, suggesting we could work out our misunderstanding like family. The third was from Colton, asking if we could meet for dinner. I declined the first 2 and accepted the third. Colton chose a small restaurant downtown, the kind of place where we could have a private conversation without running into anyone we knew. When I arrived, he was already there, looking older and more tired than I'd seen him since our father's funeral. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. We ordered drinks in silence, both of us apparently trying to figure out how to begin a conversation that was years overdue. "I owe you an apology," Colton said finally. "Several apologies, actually." I waited. I knew about Preston's plan. Not all the details, but I knew he was planning to pressure you into selling. I told myself it was just business, that maybe it would be better for you to take the money and start fresh somewhere else. But the truth is, I was jealous. When you told us about the dealership, about what you'd built, I realized you'd accomplished something real while I'd just gotten lucky with cryptocurrency. And instead of being proud of my sister, I let Preston convince me that bringing you down would somehow make me feel better about myself. It was more honesty than I'd expected from him, and more than I'd gotten from our family in years. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I got a call this morning. My crypto portfolio crashed. Some kind of market manipulation, regulatory crackdown I don't really understand at all. But I'm basically broke, Laurel. Everything I had was tied up in digital assets that are now worthless." I felt a mix of sympathy and irony at the news. "I'm sorry to hear that. The thing is, I realized sitting in my overpriced house this morning that I don't actually know how to build anything. I know how to get lucky and I know how to spend money, but I don't know how to create value the way you do." "It's not too late to learn." He looked up at me with something that might have been hope. "I was wondering, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider giving me a job? Not charity, I mean actually working for you. I could start at the bottom, learn the business properly." It was the last thing I'd expected him to ask, and I found myself considering it seriously. "What makes you think you'd be good at automotive sales?" "Honestly, I don't know if I would be. But I'm tired of not knowing how to do anything useful, and I'm tired of being the kind of person who tears other people down instead of building something himself." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or false humility, but seeing only exhaustion and genuine regret. If I said yes, it would mean starting as a lot attendant. Minimum wage, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. It would mean proving yourself every single day, with no special treatment because you're my brother. I understand. And it would mean being the kind of person who puts customers first, who treats everyone with respect regardless of what they drive or how much money they have. I want to be that person, Laurel. I want to be someone you can be proud to work with. I made my decision. Monday morning, 8 a.m. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty. 3 months later, I received an email that changed everything again. The sender was listed as E. Morrison and the subject line read, "Regarding William Greystone, Family Matters." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something about the formal tone made me curious enough to open it. "Dear Ms. Greystone, my name is Emmeline Morrison, and I believe we share a father. I have been researching my family history and have discovered some information about William Greystone that I think you should know. Would you be willing to meet for coffee to discuss this? I understand this must come as a shock, and I apologize for contacting you out of the blue. However, I believe this information could be important for both of us. Sincerely, Emmeline Morrison." I stared at the email for a long time before forwarding it to my attorney and asking her to do a background check on Emmeline Morrison. The results came back clean. She was 31, lived in Vermont, owned a small bookstore that was struggling financially, and had no criminal record or obvious connection to my family's recent business troubles. We met the following weekend at a neutral location halfway between our cities. Emmeline turned out to be a tall woman with dark hair and my father's eyes, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it contained important documents. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she said as we settled into a corner booth. "I know this must be difficult." "It's definitely unexpected," I replied. "What information did you want to share?" She opened her portfolio and pulled out several documents, birth certificates, legal papers, and what looked like correspondence. "My mother worked as a secretary at your father's first law firm before he married your mother. They had a relationship that lasted several years, and I was born in 1994. I did the math quickly. That would have been when my parents were going through their rough patch, when my father had spent months working late and coming home in moods that ranged from guilty to angry. He acknowledged paternity, Emmeline continued, and he set up a trust fund for my education and support. But the terms were very specific. The money could only be used for school and basic living expenses, and it would be terminated if I ever attempted to contact his legitimate family. But you're contacting me now. Because the trust was tied to property that I've recently learned was sold without my knowledge. The land in upstate New York that was supposed to secure my inheritance was quietly transferred to Prestons Grace 5 years ago, around the time of your father's death. I felt pieces clicking into place. Preston is our uncle, who apparently decided that honoring my father's wishes wasn't in the family's best interest. She showed me the documentation, legal papers that proved our father had intended for her to inherit a substantial sum, and evidence that Preston had manipulated the probate process to redirect those assets to himself. I'm not looking for a handout, Emmeline said quickly. I just want what was legally mine. But I can't afford to fight Preston's lawyers on my own. I looked at this half-sister I'd never known existed, thinking about families and loyalty, and the difference between blood relations and people who actually cared about each other. How much are we talking about? According to the original trust documents, about $400,000 plus interest. It was a significant sum, enough to save her bookstore and provide real financial security. It was also money that Preston had essentially stolen from both of us. I'll help you, I decided. Not just with legal fees, but with Preston. It's time someone in this family faced consequences for taking what doesn't belong to them. The legal battle took 6 months, during which I got to know Emmeline and discovered that she had inherited not just our father's eyes, but his sense of justice and his stubborn refusal to back down from a fight. Her bookstore was exactly the kind of community-centered business I respected, not particularly profitable, but providing real value to people who needed it. When we finally won the settlement, forcing Preston to repay the inheritance plus penalties and interest, Emmeline did something that surprised me. She used half the money to expand her bookstore into a community center offering literacy programs and small business workshops. The other half she invested in a fund to help other independent bookstores survive in the digital age. I learned something from watching what you built, she told me as we celebrated the victory. Money is just a tool. What matters is what you build with it. By then, Colton had worked his way up to junior sales associate, and I was proud to discover that he was genuinely good at helping customers find the right vehicles for their needs. He'd learned to listen more than he talked, and customers responded to his authenticity. Preston, meanwhile, had been forced to sell most of his real estate holdings to cover the legal settlement and the failed automotive investment scheme. Tanner's law firm was facing disciplinary action for their role in the attempted extortion, and Marcus Webb had quietly disappeared from the investment scene altogether. On a warm evening in October, almost exactly 1 year after that first family dinner, I found myself back at Colton's house. But this time it was for a different kind of gathering, a celebration of Emmeline's community center opening, hosted by my brother, who had learned the difference between showing off and sharing success. The guest list was smaller, but more meaningful. Eli was there with his wife, beaming with pride at what his old dealership had become. Caro had brought her new boyfriend, a teacher who appreciated that she worked for someone who valued loyalty over profit. Jennifer Walsh, the single mother I'd helped with a car, had become a friend and was there with her 2 children who were thriving in their new stability. As I stood in the garden behind the house, watching people who had become my chosen family, I thought about the journey from that first dinner to this one. I'd started the year as the family disappointment and ended it as someone who had learned that the most important victories weren't about proving other people wrong, but about building something worth being right about. My phone buzzed with a text from a potential customer who'd found my dealership online and wanted to schedule an appointment. As I typed back a response, offering to meet with them first thing Monday morning, I realized that this was what success actually looked like, not the moment when everyone finally acknowledged what I'd accomplished, but all the quiet moments when I got to help people solve problems and build better lives. I'd started with nothing but determination and ended with something that would outlast any family drama or business rivalry. I'd built a legacy that wasn't about proving I was better than the people who'd underestimated me, but about becoming the kind of person who helped others discover what they were capable of building themselves. They'd laughed when I walked into that first dinner, but I hadn't needed to roar to make them listen. I just built quietly, steadily, until they had no choice but to hear me. And, in the end, that had made all the difference. If this story of turning underestimation into empire inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of people who built their power in silence until the world had no choice but to listen.